Okay, just a few words of introduction. Welcome everybody on this beautiful day. First lecture of the season. Everybody's just on the edge. Students have just had the first date with their teacher, right? So it's like complicated. It should be the beginning of an adventure, but it's really like the first episode of a reality show, right? With all of that complication. So if you see that kind of strange look in the audience, it's that sort of post-date, post-first date feeling. Also first date here for you, right? Yeah. And I hope you will come back. Hope that we will be nice for you. Julien, it's office, JDS Architects is an office based in Copenhagen since 2006. You have maybe 4 other partners, is that right? Or yeah. 4 partners, so team of 5. Before that was Plot with Bjarke Engels, which was exactly 5-year experiment starting in 2001. Before that, OMA Rotterdam for just a little bit of time. Before that was finishing the last of 6 schools. Bartlett, I think, was the one that killed you off. I mean, you could argue that if you do 6 schools of architecture and one of them actually you graduate, there's something wrong with that school, right? So somehow that school tricked you into becoming a regular student and getting a degree. So that was the Bartlett. But before that was also already at OMA, so at OMA Rotterdam, again as a student. So some kind of illegitimate transfer backwards and forwards between school and office. And the moment you're actually out of school, you get out of the office like really fast and set up your own office. And it goes like this. So it's a kind of nomadic story. So before that first stint at OMA is about another 5 schools, which gets us back to Brussels. And before that, I think you were born in Brussels, right? So sort of super Brussels, but operating in Copenhagen. And I think what's of course great is that your office and you yourself have been embarrassingly successful. And so there's this kind of phenomenon of that moment in time. Even it becomes somehow almost a kind of Scandinavian phenomenon, or at least this part of Europe, in which a series of architects are asked and can deliver architecture which has a certain, a very sharp, clear edge to it, and it seems to me what's kind of common about this work is that there's never anything the same. It's like really relentlessly every time different. So it's a kind of requires an almost military capacity to generate for each different job a completely different concept, but also for that concept to be in a way super sharply defined, so that in a certain sense the project speaks for itself. Right? That's the theory of it. This goes everywhere from kind of lampposts to staircases to cities. So if you are used to thinking of objects like furniture having a kind of self-branding capacity, with this generation of architects, that's also true of cities and everything in between. So I think it's a sort of a super interesting phenomenon, which you know, of course, because of the exhibitions, because of the books, because of the videos, because of the blogs, and so on. So the last thing you need is actually to listen to the architect. Right? Because this work is speaking for itself, and also it's speaking through multiple medium. But we did the old-fashioned thing to invite the architect to come and talk to you. Julien, great that you're here.
Thanks. Can I get the lights off? Okay. So thanks, Mark, for this intro and for inviting, of course. Thanks, Ben, for dealing with all my little issues to get here, and Lucia as well. So I'm gonna show, first I'm just gonna show the office, because I kind of like my office, and I like the people in it, and I like this aspect of the office, which is very much, compliant to my own sort of past, as Mark described, which is this sort of a kind of multifaceted international location where you can see a lot of young people, obviously, some older ones, but I'm not claiming to employ Cecil Baldman. He's working with us on some projects. This is our new office in Brussels, rather empty still. This is a happy French guy delivering a project. You can see some New Yorkers in the background. Another thing that's obvious is that because we work in these sort of multi-national kind of conditions, we are also working, you know, using sort of the kind of basic medias of today. And this is a meeting we had with Michael Speaks, who I was teaching for in Kentucky, but also was working with on our book agenda this past year. This is just a normal day at the office where Italians rest. And so that's kind of the image of our practice, in a way, the flag of it, which should be flickering and, you know, changing, because of course, being a young office, we have a lot of incoming and you know, outgoing. And this is an image of the places where we've been working and where we've been sort of developing projects, sometimes failures, sometimes successes. I'm just going to show some of the successes quickly without going into details. A psychiatric hospital in close to Copenhagen in Helsingør. A project that's called the VM Houses. I'm not going to go into details because I'm sure you know all these projects. So I'm just going to show one aspect of each. For this one, the fact that we developed these sort of weird balconies that were meant to actually activate, you know, a potential vertical park, and what came out of it was this weird condition of overpopulation of barbecues onto the balconies, meaning that it is active in a sense. It's a sort of crazy view from a photographer. The M house, and then the mountain. The mountain is a very special project that, you know, all these projects were developed as plots, and what's special about this one, what I think is particularly special, is this sort of void in between, you know, the housing and the parking. Why I think this is special is because that's the place where actually a performative take is happening, or the sort of performance of the unknown is happening, where you have basically this kind of staircase that kind of takes you up and is publicly accessible and takes you all around the building, you know, all the way to the peak up there, which is also the Mount Everest picture you might have heard. Another thing that was interesting about this building is that then sort of party organizers started taking it over and taking it into a sort of a playground for their own happenings. So there was this distortion festival, electronic music festival happening in the mountain, which was a pretty sort of unexpected event for us when they asked us to do this happening. Also under the rain, I don't know why this guy has an umbrella because it's actually covered. So I'm going to go through a series of like 3 typologies of performative architecture. One is performative installation, and starting actually with 2 projects in New York. One in 2006 that we did in Artist Space. So I guess most of you know the small gallery. We were given a tiny space inside the gallery to sort of do whatever we wanted. And the idea was, instead of like showing, you know, an actual series of project or installations or sort of what do you call it, models of our work, we decided to actually make sort of an exploration on space, like trying to let people discover space, and maybe that's a kind of compression and extension of space. So the way we did it is actually to set up a program that allows to perceive the entire New York City block through this visual installation, which I'm going to show. Hopefully it's going to work. So what you have here, what you should have, let me see. Yes. So I'm just going to explain. This is the space. This tiny space is in fact the half space of the existing gallery. So what we did is we built this wall, and then we made a retro projection over onto it. And we have, as you can see up there, a little camera that's a sensor. And it senses the location of the guy, of the person in the space. You can be multiple people in the space. And the point of it is that as the person walks towards the screen, he will actually walk towards the entire New York City block all the way to the street behind. And so it looks a little bit like this. The first space that he will encounter is actually the storage space of artist space. So it's a rather messy space. We had to kind of record, visually the whole series of spaces behind. As he goes through this, we will have a sort of a studio, an artist studio that goes then into an apartment of the artist. And beyond that, there's a sort of rooftop, and then you can see the other side of the street. So this is like one sort of compressed series of spaces put together into, a sort of experience that makes you go beyond the space that you within. And this came up as a kind of idea to actually explore, the condition of space or the perception of space itself, which is something that we don't get to do much in architecture when we deal with, build projects like we do. Another installation was one that we did for the Contemplating the Void exhibition for Guggenheim, where we decided to, if I just show the space, to make an installation that would allow for people, as the idea of the sort of museum is to go down, so from the top level all the way to the ground floor. The idea here would be to go down, but not within the exhibition spaces, but in fact within the void itself, and that's why we called it the Experiencing the Void installation, and is this sort of bouncing net that spirals down all the way to the ground floor. And so this is of course not done as a project, but it's an idea. Which brings me to a person that I respect a lot, is a skater. I was myself a skater for years, and I sort of like in particular this guy's work. I call it work, but most people would call it destruction, which is a sort of form of street skating that's extremely advanced. I'm just going to show a video of what he does. And so obviously, skating in the street is all about sort of, destroying or abusing the street skate. One thing that's interesting about the way he does it is just like he's also sort of manipulating the tool itself that he's using, which is this skateboard. He invented this way of sliding where he slides on the grip like this, which was, a total revolution when it came out, at least for us skaters. And I just think like his type of intervention in space is really the sort of thing that we would like to contribute to with our work. So let's see if we manage. These are some of the projects that I would classify in different ways. This is like 2 or 3 projects that I call program landscapes, are in fact spaces, mostly public spaces, that we have injected with some programs such as this youth house in Copenhagen. It's a sailing club and a youth house, so it's devoted to, young kids. And what was interesting about it is that not only the project provided, the spaces and the kind of community spaces that were required, but also it provided this kind of somehow like topography of spaces that were not sort of so required, but unleash a kind of attitude towards using the facilities. This is actually a day where we went to shoot, where the kids decided to form 2 sort of rival teams, because there's 2 hills, and they were trying to kind of, get the hill of the opponent, and so they started like sort of playing with these sort of virtual fake guns with hockey sticks, trying to, basically doing what kids do, but in this environment being like a quite exciting setting for a photo shoot. Another project that we accomplished in the early years, 2003 here for this harbor bath in Copenhagen, was the idea to actually just provide, a space for outdoor bathing and sort of outdoor public use on the water itself, plugging it onto the existing park. So it just came up to be this sort of very busy place. Actually, not so busy on this picture, but normally on some days you have like, you can't even lay a towel on this park. And later on, we were asked. We participated in a competition to do a huge public space on the other side, because the other side, the side of the harbor, is completely deprived of activities. There's hardly anything happening. Maybe thanks to some of these like really ugly and big buildings that are not doing anything for the public space. So the idea there was to actually create a sort of extension of the piers. This is the way it looks today, which is pretty deadly. And to extend the piers onto the waterfront again. By doing that, creating a sort of a series of new connections, a new promenade, and then like trying to kind of place these different locations, these different squares in a way that would allow for sun to be optimized, giving a few spaces for actual water activities. So it's not a swimming pool as such, but it is a canoe and kayaking park. And so ending up with this scheme that where you can see one particular aspect is that it actually reconnects to the harbor bath. Unfortunately, that's an aspect that we fighting for still, the reconnection to the harbor bath. And the reason why I think it's really an important one is because it's sort of it gives an understanding of the city as a whole, instead of being like, the one side against the other side. It's very much about saying, okay, if there's stuff happening on one side, we can use it and drag it over onto the other side. So that's the scheme as it should be developed. We're going to start construction in January, so first month of next year. We just get prizes back from the construction companies, and it's okay. So I think we can attack. There's a series of programs within the project that are added that are not purely public spaces such as shops. There's the canoe sort of club, and as I explained, this connection back onto the land of the harbor bath. Which brings me to a sort of similar project in many ways in Italy, in the city of Rimini. I'm just showing this ridiculous picture because I had to present that project the day after the Dutch and the Italian team had a game, and the Italian lost. And because of my name, it felt like a bit of an issue. De Smedt is also like a Dutch name. So I was fearing a lot of sort of negative responses, both from the mayor's side, but also from the citizens. And then on top of that, there was this other historical moment, because I cannot hide my French accent, and because I'm also half French. So there's this like other situation, and so I basically showed this picture to these people, and sort of explaining that this was not so much about who I was or where I was coming from, but much more about their own issues. And the city of Rimini is an interesting place because historically in Europe it was like one of the first sort of beach party places, before Ibiza and stuff. And now it's sort of dying out as a buzzing place, and it's more becoming as a kind of family sort of holiday place. And the mayor, of course, wants to turn it into this kind of cultural hub for high culture. So the site of the competition is a private-public partnership competition. This is, I think it's 1.6 kilometer long stretch, and our sole competitor is Jean Nouvel, and I'm still waiting for results. The program is like a series of cultural venues, and then a lot of restaurants and shops and public spaces. And the idea is that we had was to kind of look at the site as what it is, which is pretty much a divide in between two cities. The one is the historical city, obviously, and then the other one is the beach city, which is literally a city, and that's what is kind of exceptional about it. There's so many buildings that actually have addresses, they actually have numbers, and these buildings are, of course, not real buildings. They're shacks where you can, either get a drink or change or have restrooms, different things. And then the issue is basically how do we deal with the connection along the sea and across from that city to the other one. So we have this situation that if you walk along the sea, along the kind of waterfront, you don't see the sea, you don't have any relationship to it because of this other one-story city that kind of stretches along the waterfront. So we decided to do something that would actually allow from going, down and up, allow from the idea of like sort of relating visually to the sea, but also kind of physically to the city behind. And then we made like a bunch of studies for that, which we always do in order to get to some sort of idea of, what could work, what could be an inspiration. In this case, it was very literal. The bullet marks, pattern of Copacabana is extremely interesting because it's the perfect kind of contraction of a long and a sort of transversal axis. So we started exploring this condition and develop it almost sort of naturally over the whole site in order to create these two conditions. This is the program breakdown. And what's interesting is that the fabric of it is very similar, but as you splice it and work with it in a three-dimensional way, you start playing with its edges, or like its kind of extremes, to the point of having here on the edge a sort of a hotel of 9 stories that is like a real sort of mount. You can climb it if you have the condition for, but it's exactly the same sort of fabric as the rest of the project. So within that footprint that's very even, there's a lot of conditions that can occur, and these conditions are happening in a three-dimensional manner, where you have restaurants and like sort of parking spaces and different shops that are all kind of inserted within the fabric, but at the same time you have a kind of 100% space of public space. So this is, let's say, a ground floor, first floor, and then if you look at it in the kind of streetscape, it's all sort of accessible. This is the hotel, which I think this is a plan of. So it is a 9-story building. It's pretty dense. It's actually a rather traditional type of hotel in the sense that it has, a corridor and like room facing the city and rooms facing the sea. But of course, it's in the section that it sort of becomes a sort of special place. And this leads to like a project that we did. Actually, it's probably the last project I've been working on for Brazil. We were called up by a group called EBX, for standing for Ike Batista Group, who's Brazil's richest man, who wants to do to develop a new convention center and sort of a shopping mall in the Gloria neighborhood of Rio. What's interesting about that neighborhood in particular is that it's overloaded with history and sort of very heavy historical issues, such as World War II monument or Museum of Modern Art. At the same time, it's loaded with infrastructural conditions, such as the airport, and this is exactly where the projects start to make sense and to be interesting, is where it meets a need and a sort of a historical setting. What we've been trying to do is to actually stretch. I mean, of course, the landscape around is extremely interesting and almost something you cannot compete against. So we've tried not to do too much architecture in that project. You have the Museum of Modern Art, which is kind of very present and very strong piece of architecture. Then you have Buller Marx that comes all the way through the Flamengo Park and is omnipresent in that site. A big deal that I wasn't aware of, that in Brazil it's so hard to actually do anything when you have historical settings, because the whole country is kind of frozen into its sort of historical beauties. Like, for instance, Buller Marx being present is almost meaning that you cannot do any architecture. So one thing that we were very much aware of is that our site was, the kind of center of focus of all these locations. At the same time, we cannot do too much. I mean, we have to sort of like be toned down. This is the marina requirements. We decided to create a new pier, which would become a pier that actually blocks the wave so that the marina can be fully used. And then within that pier, we would stretch the program. So what you have is basically a pretty mundane, sort of not so interesting set of programmatic requirements. Restaurant, shopping, convention center, and a big exhibition hall. So the idea was to like stretch that as much as we could over onto the site, create some patios to actually give in, you know, landscape qualities to a program that normally doesn't have any, which is, you know, the convention hall, and then start manipulating that cross into letting the whole neighborhood come in. The reason why we did all this, and of course benefiting from some views, was the reason we did this kind of very open plan, very landscape-like project, was in order to try to deal with a problem that there is locally, which is of course, you know, violence and sort of segregation. So that what's happening currently on the site is that the whole site is fenced off, and what we're advocating is total openness. What we believe is that this neighborhood needs to have a certain return of, you know, neighbors taking over their own spaces, which is currently not happening at all. So that the project would actually allow for, you know, a series of activities to occur, and therefore a sort of more natural type of control on the site. There was also one big requirement, was that the settings were supposed to be, or are supposed to be, the 2016 Olympics departure for the sailing competition. So you have like a series of demands that needed to be dealt with. So in the end, the project is ending up as a kind of pretty simple loop of 4 strings around, you know, this exhibition hall. Plays like this. And very much, I mean, what's sad about, yeah, this is better, like, here you can see that it sort of links the whole park connections from bullet marks, which actually surrounds the whole bay. So unfortunately, this project we recently heard we lost, so it's not gonna happen. At least not gonna happen like that. Some local guy get the job, but we're looking forward to see what they came up with. Which brings me to actually a series of so performative architecture that I also will never perform. It's 3 projects that we've been working on that are all lost projects, but I think are interesting because first, I've never shown them. They're recent projects, and except from one of them. And secondly, I think it's also like, it's interesting to see that, you know, within the practice, we try to achieve something that sometimes doesn't really get to where it should be, but is an important aspect of the project. If you take this is Beirut. So it's a project for the Performing Arts House in Beirut. And it's a site that's very special because it's located on one side, you have, you know, a skyway or sort of a highway that divides really 2 neighborhoods. One is the new BCD, Beirut Central District, which is, you know, a very incredible kind of developing ground. And the other one is this sort of like more sort of historical neighborhood that's somewhat left as is. The site was, of course, regulated very specifically. What we decided is to actually try to take an abstract first take on the project and do this kind of 40 by 40 cube full volume and try to see what we could do with it. There's a series of programs that are required, and of course it's a pretty exciting condition because it's all sort of performing and art programs. Another thing that was or maybe a thing that was much more interesting about the whole brief was that they outline a specificity of the Beirut art scene, was that they had a lot of street art happening, or street performances. So what we started looking at is ways to put the program together in in a manner that would allow for some sort of a porosity or some elements of a porosity within the building. These kind of various decks or various terraces that would allow for public performances to occur. So this is the sort of volume that we ended up with that allows for, you know, an entrance front and back. There would be an open entrance that would allow for anything to happen, and then a kind of terrace deck that also allows for public performances. So you have the kind of conditions of view. And then the way you circulate through the building is actually outdoor, so you can get from one to the other of these sort of open spaces outdoor. And then you get into the real sort of official performance spaces that are, in a way, symbolically, it's unfortunate that they end up being on the top, because of course it's what we want to show is that the main thing is the sort of voids, but that's there's also some practical issues. So this is, you know, the way the place should be. And if you look at it, I mean, it's a building that's mostly experience in section. You have these sort of the big halls and the exhibition spaces and the theater here, the cinema, but then mostly is these sort of voids that are orchestrating or organizing the actual solids. So that's the view from the back, where you have, you know, a stage that's open there. This is the top stage or the top terrace. That's the kind of lobby where, you know, the interior, the sort of the arrival space gets sucked into the interior of the place. This is just the performance hall. And the plan, very simple, in a way very basic. I'm just not going to go through it in detail. But in the section again, I mean, you get to see the idea of the project, where you have, you know, entrance hall, back entrance hall with happenings, and this sort of terrace. And the rest is sort of a library here, offices, exhibition space, and the auditoriums. Moving on from there to a project in Taipei that we did as a sort of open competition, which is really tough because I can't remember. I mean, I think in the Beirut one there was like 600 and more submittal. In this one, I don't know how many, but there was also quite a few. What was interesting for us was that the project was actually suggesting that there would be, it's a pop music center, so I mean, I don't know actually much about pop music, but the kind of condition that interested me the most was this divide in between having an open air scene or stage and an indoor stage, and how we could sort of place that into a site that was pretty complex. You know, one half was on one side of a busy road, the other one on the other side, and it was sort of a challenge to deal with that. So what we did is actually trying to make an urban form, or like an urban project that would deal with these conditions and then take advantage of it in order to create a sort of an unexpected condition of two stages facing each other across a void. So that void would be the place where anything could happen. And anything could be from, you know, a sports event to art event to big gatherings. And so we basically resolve all the other program, like all the offices and all the kind of facilities that were required in order to get that sort of a project to run. We use those in order to fill, you know, the connections, or like the sort of across the street connections that were required for the project. So you have this urban scape, let's say, and then this sort of public space condition of a void, sort of two stages facing each other across a void, overviewing the city and connecting onto the parks. And then we had to design also the full site in terms of parks. So we decided to, of course, work with this similar kind of typology of spaces. I'm just going through quickly. So, well, this is very burned. But basically, these are like all the sort of boring spaces, you know, the the basic, the offices and the different spaces that are supposed to create the connections with the public space on top. This is the void across, and the final project. So that's a project that we, as I said, lost as well. I mean, we got a mention or something. It doesn't get us very far, but it allowed us to think about, you know, this issue of sort of urbanity or like urban conditions and public space again. This is a project that we did earlier, and I'm just showing it because of its insanity in a way. It's a private Danish developer who came to us and asked us to design 6 million square meters, which is a kind of completely incomprehensible set of or conditional scale. And he also said that it had to be 666 meters high, which was also sort of weird. And after a while, he came to and said it was 888 meters. And apparently he had like a lot of discussions, you know, in the background. Because at the end he said like it had to be like 1,111 meters high, and on top of all that it had to be feng shui. So you're starting to get the sort of idea of the setting. We're in Shenzhen, next to Hong Kong, and it was at this time when, you know, Shenzhen is sort of booming and developing as a sort of extension of Hong Kong. When we went to the site and started analyzing it, we realized that the condition was actually across, you know, the past 20, 30 years, like really depressing. There was like no more nature happening in the region. We went from this condition of urbanity to this one in 20 years. And this was actually happening against, you know, topography and everything. I mean, like sort of flattening the land. This is Hong Kong, so like as a condition, it's a very interesting condition because you have, you know, almost like a three-dimensional urbanism with nature. And this was the sort of version of it in Shenzhen. So what we started as a kind of question was, could we do a project that's, you know, a new Hong Kong, or sort of an extension of Hong Kong? This was our site. And what we started looking at, I mean, after a lot of tryouts and a lot of failures, trying to do, you know, an interesting tower of 1,111 meters, whatever, and like not really getting anywhere, we just realized that we were asking ourselves the wrong question. Is that it wasn't about doing a tower, it was actually doing a city. That was a real question. So we started looking at this condition of overlaying neighborhoods onto each other and sort of understanding, you know, what sort of components of a neighborhood we could provide in order to create that sort of vertical urbanism. And so we came up with this very simple paper model that was actually the sort of startup for the whole project. If you look at the project in a sort of like in plan and without the program, but just look at the void, the main void, it's quite funny that it actually looks like a Mies van der Rohe column. But in fact, the project is this kind of round set of programs where you have on the inside all the commercial and all the office spaces, on the outside all the residential spaces, and then parks sort of tying these two together. So if you look at it in section, when it gets deeper and darker, it's public programs such as, you know, cinemas and sports fields. And then when you zoom in, you have, you know, terraces towards the inside, and then commercial spaces on the outside. And of course, this was, you know, a study, let's say. It was developed to a certain level, but not fully. And it was also kind of stopped at the moment of a crisis when developers started running away from these kind of developments. But it was interesting as a sort of way of thinking, you know, even like contextual issues. I mean, you know that in this sort of a neighborhood of Shenzhen, you know, everything will go in like no time. So it's also like a way to deal with that question, maybe a pretty radical way, but and so we presented that project to the Shenzhen Biennale back then, 2008, and 2 hours before presenting, actually opening the Biennale, this model here disappeared. So it was like, you know, presented in our space, and somebody came around and picked the tower, just the tower. I mean, the base was left. It's just like because it's made of foams, out of foam, so it's 1 kilo or 1.5 kilo. It's nothing. Somebody just like left with it. And so I was joking to King Jun Ma, the curator, that you know that project would start, you know, replicating like hell in the region in the future, which of course didn't happen. But it was sort of, I mean, he was actually really sort of pissed off about the whole story because I don't know, of this kind of Chinese guilt. I don't know what it was. I thought it was really funny. And we also, like, he redid the whole model for us and then sent it to us, but he did it in Perspex, so it was like 100 kilos now. So we can't, I mean, basically it sits in our office, we can't move it anywhere, and it's just impossible. And what brings me to a last project, which is a project that I'm sort of completing now for a ski jump in Oslo, and I'm going to show it in a sort of different way that I do normally. It's slightly more in depth to give it like the whole history behind. It's what interested me in the first place to do the competition. It's again an open competition. This time we succeeded, so it's a little more happy ending. What interested me was this sort of history of the place, that it's sort of for like 100 years has been the place where, you know, ski jumping as a discipline has evolved, and you can see different iterations of the ski jump. You can see, for instance, in this like super weird setting of a lake, a natural lake in the bottom during the summertime. Like a sort of pretty picture of this sort of weird animal that landed into this like natural setting. And then in '82, they made this version of it. So it evolved like 18 times until now. And this iteration was the one we had to deal with. It's a sort of the ski jump as we were given to deal with. It was a place where, you know, back in '52 when the Olympics were on, they had 120,000 people over there, which is the record so far of attendance. And so we looked at this whole history and started reflecting on it. So we did the competition and won the competition. Everything sounded perfect. And then there's happened some post-competition drama. There's been a lot more than what I'm going to show, but you know, there's been a few moments. First thing was that, you know, somebody proposed that, and this is like, of course, in a Scandinavian context, everybody can say whatever they want, and of course they get heard, you know, in the main press. Should the place be changed? Like, should Holmenkollen be moved to another location? And there was like quite a bit of a discussion regarding that issue, because you could save money, you could like do all sorts of things. Should, you know, Holmenkollen be covered? I mean, be an indoor space? That was also going on for a while. Of course, you know, it was killed because it was way too over budget. One of the problems of Holmenkollen as a location is that it's very windy, so there's a lot of, it's a very dangerous place. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, US Open these days. It's kind of impossible to get a game going. But in Oslo, it's a little more dangerous because, you know, they do jump and sometimes wind does blow, and then accidents could happen. So another thing was that then they decided not to build the ski jump, even though it had been sort of decided, and you know, the competition was won. And I think that comes out of this kind of political sort of attitude to be scared of too much public opinions. Then at some point, some guy came up and said that warned the international architects community not to submit projects in Norway and in Oslo in particular, because you know, they would not be realized. And it's true that Oslo has a pretty long string of international competition not being realized, some of which OMA has participated in. So then, after all, in December, they actually decided to rehabilitate the ski jump. So, meaning like they would do it, but they didn't really say how. What it turned out to be is that they wanted to make a renovation of the ski jump, and then we had to, which I'll explain, to study what that meant. Then the person that was responsible for all that got kicked out because she kind of hid, she was hiding some budget problems that were occurring with the competition and the reality of the budget. This project started in 2005 with, as a kind of political decision, to be a 50 million Norwegian kroner project. When in 2007 we took on the competition, it was a 500 million kroner budget, and we ended up building it for 800 million. So you could see that there's like a pretty sort of extensive gap of knowledge in terms of like budget calculation, and she was partially responsible of that. So in this mess, we started a petition because we could see that things were like so sketchy that we had to intervene. So we actually made a petition online where you could support our project, and it recorded like 2,000 votes, which I think was enough to start a certain discussion among the municipality. Then came up this issue that that we were not exactly professionals in ski jumping, and that's so true, because if you know anything about Denmark and Belgium, it's like the two most flat countries in the world, together with the Netherlands. So if you look at the history of Norway with all these and this was also learning from me, all these great names, historical and contemporary great ski jumpers. I mean, you take Denmark and it's got basically one skier that's okay, and it's an alpine skier, and like Belgium has known. So the question was like this sort of, looking at the Zaha's achievements and sort of the pretty important achievement when it comes to ski jumping, and just kind of wondering, what has actually sort of allowed that condition, and just completely like taking it as a joke, but like also like sort of as a way to sort of get back to the issue of the criticism that we were under this attack of whether we would be able to do it or not. So the first thing was being Norwegian and whatever that meant, wearing some crazy hats, or but basically meant like being like having a local office, which is what we did. So we opened up an office in Oslo, and then sort of discussing this issue of the icon of a country, of a nation, and sort of looking at what that could mean in terms of a project. And in fact, at that point, trying to re-explain what our project was about. So we just sort of went in and explained the basics of our project over and over in order to kind of gain back this sort of agreement that we already get officially from the competition, but in this case from the citizens. And the basic idea was to say, okay, there's an ideal slope, and this is something that we have as a given, and there's issues of wind protection, so we're making the wind protection condition. Then we sort of extending that, and by offsetting that, considering maybe a simplification of the shape. By doing so, we also decided to move all the land program, the program that's supposed to support the project, into the hill, so that it becomes this sort of a slightly more simple shape that then is being reconnected by an elevator, so that all programs are along one string. Then the kind of cherry on top was to say, instead of making a project that is an icon only, it's actually a project that allows for rethinking, the idea of the icon, and actually stating that the icon is in fact Oslo, because what's interesting about this location is that it's the best place to view Oslo. So this is the Oslo Fjord, and this is how you could sort of imagine, experiencing that place. Outside, whether it rains or snows or whatever, you could actually see the city in the most kind of amazing condition. So these are views from the competition. And then later on, we worked on the project, developing, you know, the different sort of like little aspects of it, and I'll go through some of them. This is the project that we ended up getting an agreement on. You see it's pretty faithful to the original project, but I'll go to some aspects of that that are sometimes great, sometimes really painful. We were first required to study a rehabilitation, which meant that we had actually to renovate potentially the structure. So instead of doing a whole new jump, we also were asked to study this. And by study, I mean like go all the way through. And this is like basically wrapping the existing ski jump with a steel structure just in order to extend it for a few meters, which was totally absurd. And this was the other study that we had to make, which is our jump from the competition. Finally, in April, we are given, you know, the news that we're gonna be hired for the job that we already won, you know, months before. But then they still don't know what to do, and they don't know what level of a ski jump they're gonna be doing, because there's all these different sort of steps in ski jumping, you know, from the K18, the K15, 115 was like the existing one. So we still don't know. In the end, they kind of settled for the K120, and then we start studying it. There's a lot of like sort of very demanding little aspects that I'm not going to go through. But in the end, we end up agreeing on this setup and this way of sort of splitting the project in different conditions, different sub-projects that we had to deal with different levels of importance. So you have, of course, the in-run, like the actual jump, and the landing. It's a very important aspect of the project because the landing is, in fact, really expensive to make, considering that you have to dig into the rocks of the landscape. Then little things such as this commentator and judges boxes, very demanding as well because every judge has to see the jump from the very top to the very end. Then the arena, the media boxes where basically all the TV and the journalists are, and then all these different conditions. If you look on the other side, one that I will sort of point at is this weird combo of the King's Lounge, so it's like where the royal family hangs out, and then the shop. A beautiful package. And so if you take that location, that's the kind of royal family lounge with their, you know, guest of honor. And so it, of course, has to be a sort of a grand spot. But at the same time, you know, when we went through the first revision of the project after they kind of build it, you know, according to drawings, but totally not according to details, we were like appalled by, you know, the level of interest that the Norwegians have towards their royal family. It looked like I don't know, like a shanty town of some sort. So this is changing now. The structure of the jump is of course the main thing, and the way it's built, it's a steel structure. It's in fact, I wouldn't say that interesting. I mean, not that sort of advanced. You know, it's a lot of steel. I mean, 1,000 tons of steel. It's built in 8 pieces, so it's sort of being built, you know, in chunks. And we had to set up a sort of a workshop or like a kind of assembly shop at the back of the drum in order to make this possible. So all the portions, the sections that you see, were assembled fully as you see them here in this location, and in order to compose the full structure. One thing that was though quite a battle to get through is the fact that we had to study, you know, the deformations in the wind of the jump. Not so much because we were fearing that it was going to break, but in fact because it's a matter of comfort and of just simple, you know, use of the hill as a jump. So we consider at some point putting a huge weight on the top in order to kind of stabilize the thing. And we have the possibility to still do so if it's necessary, but we need to kind of experiment the jump a little bit before. So this is in tune with the facade. The facade is you know, something that needs to kind of act as a buffer towards the winds, because of course it takes a lot of winds. So the point is that it has to be perforated, and up to 50% over here, and in between 35 and 50% for the jump itself. So we went through a series of different options, like for instance this is what we did at the mountain, a kind of perforated steel plate, or this one, which was really exciting, is a chainmail, but also extremely expensive. And in fact, in order to make it at all, we had to like press the button of, you know, like start production immediately as we had won the competition, in order for it to be even produced on time, because all these rings are just being welded, you know, together one by one. So it's totally insane as a production, but it looks beautiful. Then we looked at the sort of stretch metal, like the new museum facade, which doesn't, like, surprisingly doesn't work for wind buffer, because there's too much imprecisions and sort of mistakes into the splicing of the steel that actually creates more turbulences or divert more wind than you would want to out of it. So in the end, we got this one that was the best result in the wind tunnels. It's a very straightforward sort of a mesh that stretches one way, and allows for one thing that is extremely practical and became like the concept of the whole facade, which is that you can just stretch it from one side all the way through, down, and then hook it back up one piece. And that became interesting in the idea of actually creating this sort of a feeling of, you know, this kind of stretch piece that you bend, so that if you kind of zoom on it, it's actually like literally being bent as a sort of yeah, almost as a fabric. And this is just pictures during construction. It's pretty tough to build in Norway. Like, it gets really really cold and snowy. So this is in the making. So finally in October we started construction, and this is just as a kind of symbol. You know, we decapitated the existing ski jump, so took the head off, and it's actually still lying on site next door. I don't know what they're gonna do with it. I think it's just gonna stand there and rot. So this was the first, in a way, the first condition of construction, and the first failure is that you can see that this existing building around which we're building is sort of a remain of the old jump, and it's something that I'm still trying to get rid of, but I don't think I'm managing. It's what we call the Kulbygg. It's an existing administration building that is somehow been the excuse to call this a renovation and not a new build on a political level. So there's this big question of whether we have the Kulbygg or we actually deal with it and try to take it away or slice it, so that there is a visual connection in between the two sides of the ski jump, which has been the intention from the competition all along. So basically the idea is that you have the lobby entrance here, and then you could go down, you know, into the arena from this staircase, this existing building, and sort of have this sort of interaction of the different programs. But currently it's looking like this, and not like this as we're trying to get it. Okay, it's really hard to see anything there. So this is the underside of the jump. And this is when we started, like, you know, feeling how the jump would be, and the sort of various steps of building the structure. I'm just trying to go through. This was like a midterm office visit where we brought the whole office to see the jump. Like I said, it's a really tough place to build. Like it's foggy almost like half of the time. And then on November 24, we raised up the last piece, the 8th section of the jump, which is a pretty dramatic experience, especially when you get closer and closer. And these dudes were just smoking cigarettes and like holding, you know, the thing and like so, like, it really, I mean, that's when you know you're working in a sort of a Viking land. So it took a while to get it in place because of the wind, and that last piece was heavier than most of the other ones. You can see that the connection was made, and then we kept the crane holding it for quite a while, and it was being like released sort of gradually to test that you know, the cantilever was working. I love this sort of moment of lack of trust in whatever, you know, engineering has been sort of deployed. And so, at some point, some guy started coming into the hill. Like, of course, it was far from being ready, but you know, it's too tempting. So locally, it's such a big, you know, like people, like there's an entire neighborhood of people living just next to the ski jam, and they're all like total fanatic skiers. So of course, at some point, you know, some kid get drunk and they're like, okay, let's do it now. So that was the first moment. Then the construction went on until it was sort of getting close to completion. This is when we started doing, so basically like all this inside stuff is, you know, just backbone for placing all the installations, because there's a lot of installation going into the structure. And then the project was more or less, say, done in its basic form. I mean, you can see that it's still not done over here, but it's more or less done with the facade. And then some guys came over and base jumped it. And it was like this sort of, I have only really bad pictures, but it was pretty intense because, of course, first they had to burst into the place, and then they had to like climb up the whole thing. Sort of, I don't think there was even like a stair at the time, so they just had to get up, and then they base jumped, which was kind of intense. And then another little issue that happened is that politically there was a vote to have a skier called Anette Sagan, a woman skier, to be the first jumper to jump the hill. And that was the sort of like, you know, first time a woman would actually inaugurate, you know, Olympic ski jump. And then this idiot here, this Bjørn Hammerhøen, is like the ultimate sort of star of ski jumping in Norway. He organized together with his friends from the ski association to like coup the whole political decision, and the night before just jumped, you know, illegally on the hill to and apparently later on he started crying about it on TV and was really sorry. But you know, she was supposed to be the one to sort of do the first jump, which is too bad that she didn't. So these are the pictures of what happened right after, which is basically the test championship. We had a soft opening to test the place, and that's not in order to do a reopening, but it was more because there's a lot of logistics to be dealt with on site that we had to try out. You know, a lot of journalists are coming in, like 2,000 journalists need to report from the World Championship, so we had to test it one time first. So this was one of the first jumps during the championship, and just some views of the place as it is today. So we're almost, you know, finishing the place now. These are views we took during the championship. I love this one where the whole city is kind of gone in the clouds. And we also did you know, in order to be able to wear, we did an iPhone app with some guys in Norway, which unfortunately we didn't manage to get sort of a percentage on, so they're just like selling like maniacs and we're not getting anything. And then I'm just gonna end with this image of the jump being this, what I was told once is that it looked like this fantastic long chair for God, and then I sort of tried to find you know, to Google that and find something, but couldn't. So I found this one, which I thought was pretty, pretty well placed. So, thank you.
Question?
I'm just cold, it's not because I want to leave. Any questions? Yeah.
The whole idea is that when you win a competition, that there's a feeling of triumph that you've achieved something. Not only did you navigate the political process of getting the commission after winning the competition, but the fact that you decided to also do the work of drawings of it, is a demonstration of a wish to be in control of every single aspect of it, not only the political, but down to the execution. But can you talk more about why you decided to take on construction drawings part? Because it would seem that, in a way, that's the most complicated politically because of the fact that ski jumping is such an important thing for the nation, and to get the technical aspects of the performance of the thing itself structurally and the detail levels to be
Well, I mean, I think we always trying to do the full package. I mean, it's not a. There's a lot of aspects to it, but the main one is, of course, that it's the only way we have to actually explore, architecture. It's because when, like, the competition level is like maybe 10% of what you can explore, and things such as, I mean, even though the building looks pretty faithful to the competition moment, it's still there's still like a million things that happen afterwards that were like improvements and sort of new ideas that came, and this is what makes the profession really exciting, obviously. But in countries that are much further away, like so doing some work in Mexico or like in Asia, it's harder to first to convince yourself to do it, and then to convince your client to go for it, or you have to again open. I think if we had really thought for it, we could have avoided to set up a local office for the ski jump because we were only an hour away. I think it's a lot harder when you like having to travel 12 hours and so I think we would probably be more keen on either opening offices or sort of working with someone locally if it was like a further away projects. But I haven't really, I've done collaborations with offices in China where they've been doing the detailing and we've been redlining it, and we're still waiting for the kind of drawing to redline. It's like it's really sort of something to remember. In the end, it's much more. I mean, depending on the project, some projects are sort of sufficiently standard that you can do it. Interestingly enough, I just launched open a building in Norway as well, in Stavanger, for a hotel. Which did you go or did you not go? You didn't go see it, yeah, but you were around, right? And I'm actually kind of happy you didn't go see it, because there, we didn't do the full package. We didn't draw the details of it. We had a local office do it, and like I'm not sure that I would want you to see it actually. I mean, there's a lot of aspects where we didn't have to we didn't get the chance to battle. I mean, we didn't get simply the occasion, the kind of capacity to be involved in decisions. And I think that's a big learning, actually. It's something that we need to avoid. Or we need to be better at sort of setting up those collaboration in a really intelligent way that we know who we deal with and we know what our rights.
Yep.
Hello, my name is Abdal. I just want to thank you very much for your presentation. There were some very interesting ideas in there. The thing that I kind of jumped out at me from it was looking at some of the projects that you presented, and maybe it's not something the office in general, but there's a certain scale about your project. I mean, the ski jump has a bit of a scale on its own that you can't really play around with too much. But I was looking at the other one, namely the China one, with the tower and the two theater project, where it seemed to be pretty massive compared to its context, and almost out of scale compared to what it is where it's located. I'm wondering if that ever came up in conversation, or like public were against it, saying that it's too big, or if that ever comes in conversation during the design process where the scale becomes an issue, where it's maybe too big or kind of out of place in that sense. And if you can comment on that.
I mean, I think the Chinese one is definitely too big, but you know, that was part of the requirement. I don't think, you know, the two other ones I think are pretty, I mean, they're basically smaller than the neighbors, so I don't think they kind of fit in the too big category. But I think just maybe generally, you know, the issue of, I mean, I'm fighting a building permit right now in Brussels for the exact same reason that I'm being told that the building is too big. It's like 2 stories above, you know, the neighbors, but whatever. And I mean, I think in New York, I should show you this amazing picture I found. Like, I just took yesterday next to my hotel. There's this building it's like this kind of row housing kind of thing on 8th Avenue, and there's, you know, 3-story buildings, and then there's one insert, like kind of an infill, and it's 40 stories. I mean, there's a lot of insane ones in New York, but that one is like really beyond. It's 40 stories tall. And I think like contextual issues are to be dealt with in different terms than, you know, whether it's too big or too small. I mean, if you take the Shenzhen project, it's too big for where it is now, but by the time it's done, the now is gone, and the whole neighborhood has changed completely. And this is, I mean, if you go to Shenzhen today, it's the case. I mean, all these neighborhoods have transformed completely from this sort of factory landscape to, you know, like much more upgraded type of programs. So, yeah, I mean, I mean, too big or too small. I mean, I don't know. It's something to take with a little more criticism, I think. Of course, you know, 1,000-meter tall building is maybe too big anywhere, you know, like, or is it? I mean, it's just really, maybe, I don't know. I don't think the other buildings are too big anyway. Like, they're just, feels like they fit right in.
So you don't take too big as a compliment?
As a compliment?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't care, you know. I don't.
Could be, right? You could say, I mean, one answer would be that you have to build out of scale, either bigger or smaller, otherwise you're actually not building. I mean, you're just disappearing in.
Yeah.
So you could say, you could be happy that it was that people noticed that the buildings are too big.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm happy that it stands out, but not necessarily because it's too big. I mean, I'm happy that it sort of deals with contextual issues in a way that is not maybe about whether it's too big or too small, or whether it get, you know, the right ornament as the neighbors does, but maybe because it sort of activates its location in a kind of way that makes it stand out or makes it relate, you know, differently.
I was wondering how you keep your creative process so radical on a consistent basis. How do you be radical consistently? Because all of your buildings have a different look, and so how do you avoid falling into a comfort zone or something that, a pattern that you repeat over and over, but come up with something different every time?
I think I'm too young to have that problem.
Sorry?
I'm too young to have that problem of whether, you know, it's a, I don't know, like, I mean, one thing is that, you know, the process of doing a project is very open in the office, and it's not at all, we don't have this kind of sort of insane systematic, like we have some system in case we're in desperation mode, and then we have like more like a sort of open exploration, sometimes even, you know, intuition-based sort of exploration that allows for instance, for anyone in the office to come up with an idea, which allows for, you know, diversity or sort of, you know, different sort of results. I think maybe my job is sort of to explore this sort of thread, the common thread within the project, so to try to kind of find out what could be, you know, a dialogue in between the different typologies of buildings we're doing, or the different scales of buildings, or non-buildings, which is part of the things that I was trying to kind of explain today. But I'm definitely not interested in sort of, you know, issues of aesthetics, or like that things should be one style or another style. It's not so much what we're dealing with or discussing in the office.
That's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank
By
you.
the way, Rem Koolhaas, you've heard of him, right? He's coming on the 24th, Friday 24th. Do you have a last word about that? I mean, you're one of the victims or victimizers of RMA. One thing that impresses me a lot about the RMA studio is that I think there's a disproportionately large number of people who were there and have done really well afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Like somehow it has clarified things for them rather than destroyed them. Do you have any kind of view about that? Like, are you a survivor, or were you energized by that?
Of course. I mean, clearly. You know, it's like, I think but I think it's even for people that haven't been there and sort of, you know, finding a sort of, it's not really a method, but it's like a way of exploring. Like there's this kind of idea of, you know, abundance and sort of an insane amount of tryouts, which is definitely a way to open up your eyes. You know? But then it's a matter of afterwards of deciding also. And I think we're definitely deciding differently than, you know, Rem has maybe showed us in the past. But we also totally sort of, you know, needed that moment of opening our eyes, just like, you know, students do. I mean, I was there as a student actually to start with, and
it's a kind of a school.
yeah, and the fact that it was, I mean, you've given a lot of responsibilities actually. I mean, at least back then, I don't know how the office works today. I mean, there was only one office back then, so. But that was really interesting that you would have a lot on your shoulders. So.
Anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you.